3 times a year, I get my hair cut by one of the Order of St. Clair. I do it myself, but the heavy shag that builds up behind my ears and across my neck is best tackled head-on. Sister Marjorie loves to talk as she trims, of the weather, of Franciscan life, of people we meet, and the questions we struggle with. I always find the last 5 minutes excruciating. With the job nearly complete, she'll lean closer, searching for any outlying hairs, and I'll feel her breath tickle the tips of my ears. It's sensual and uncomfortable, intimate and irritating. It makes me think in ways I shouldn't. My most recent cheering was interrupted by a sudden arrival. Friar Lawrence, another of my order, entered in a state of agitation. A white scum was forming at his temples, and his robes clung tightly to his back and thighs.
Brother John, I have desperate need of your help.
He shoved a hastily scribbled letter in my palm and bade me make for Mantua that morning. He had an urgent message for Romeo, son of Montague. I'd heard stories of this lovesick youth who spent his days weeping under sycamore trees while his peers brawled in the street. He was said to be an eligible bachelor, but as a man of God, this was no concern of mine. However, Friar Lawrence assured me this was no fleeting fancy, but an attempt to uphold a marriage he'd overseen just days before. I felt my disposition soften and my inclination harden. If this was a matter for the church, it was my duty to help. And besides, I like walking. A hard hike I had of it, setting out for Mantua with the sun high in the sky, its rays scorching my newly exposed neck. Sweat stung my bristles, and before long I removed my cloak and hung it over my staff, hoping to find some shade beneath. The road to Mantua was straight and unerring, lined with cypress and poplar trees, unchanged since the days of the Republic. I have walked many roads in my time as an itinerant preacher. I've stopped at palaces and hovels, helping people of every sort and situation. My bare feet are reduced to inanimate stone wedges from years of tramping, although every year or so my soles shed their calluses and a week of agony begins as sensation returns. I distract myself with fond memories of my wanderings in distant lands through Tyre and Illyria, Dacia and Denmark. My adventures are consolation for a life that is poor and sometimes lonely. Emerging from these musings, I found myself passing through forgotten countryside. Haywains lay upturned on their sides, and cattle roamed freely across the land. At a fork in the road, I saw a sign for Villeggio, and remembered that my old friend Arnold was working in that city, ministering to the sick. Arnold was a brilliant scholar who spoke 5 languages and could talk at length on almost any subject you chose. I felt it would be a missed opportunity not to see my friend. Neither of us were getting any younger, and it was scarcely a diversion. I headed west, certain I would still be in Mantua by sundown. As I continued, I heard the roar of the Mincio River, and through the haze could make out a walled city beyond. But as I crossed the impressive stone bridge and entered the city limits, I did not see another soul. A discarded pile of shields told me the sentries had abandoned their posts. Inside the walls, I found only empty streets. The market stalls buzzed with flies gorging on rotten fruit. Fearing the place had been overrun by the plague, I held my sleeve against my face, and yet, now and then, I caught snatches of muttering and giggling from behind closed doors, like I was part of some immense private joke. I went to the church, hoping I might find some trace of Arnold there. As I climbed the steps, I was jolted by a shriek and saw a young man streak past me, giddy with excitement and utterly naked. Hot on his heels was a young woman, similarly lacking in clothes. They did not pause to acknowledge me and slipped off down a narrow passageway. Confused and unnerved by this encounter, I entered the church, which was cool and quiet in the twilight of the day. I heard snoring from one of the pews and was pleased to find my friend lying in one, sound asleep. Less pleasing was the sight of the maiden lying with Arnold, her head resting on his substantial belly. Arnold was surprised when I woke him, and a strained silence followed as he roused his companion, and after a few hushed words in her ear, she scampered off. I was just as stunned to find my esteemed brother lying in sin in a place of worship. This was not the Arnold I knew. His wiry hair jutted out at tousled angles, and his cheeks had a youthful, ruddy glow. I took him by the arm. There would be time for explanations on the way to Mantua. I dragged Arnold blinking into the square, and we made for the city gates. My friend appeared distracted and avoided my gaze. "I see no evidence of plague here," I muttered. "Where are the sick, the bodies?" Arnold spoke clearly for the first time.
"That is not the nature of the illness here. These people are sick with love." He grinned.
It was as if a glass had been wiped clean before me. The whispers in the doorways, the windows thrown wide open, curtains trailing in the breeze, hats, shoes, chores, manners, all forgotten in the joys of the flesh. We had to leave. As we crossed the bridge, I wondered how I was going to broach Arnold's impropriety with other members of the order. I was distracted by the sight of soldiers, a brigade of horsemen bearing the crest of the Duke of Mantua. They lowered their spears and warned us not to step any closer. I asked the reason, was told that the Duke had placed the city under quarantine until the plague had passed. I pleaded. We were only visitors with urgent business elsewhere, but the horsemen would not be swayed. While I'd been protesting, I hadn't noticed Arnold slip back inside the city walls. I turned round, calling out for him, but my cries rang out unanswered. As night fell, I made my way through the streets, the sounds of earthy congress now ringing in my ears, gasps and guttural moans akin to wild animals in a forgotten forest. Desperate for something to eat, I knocked at the door of a tavern and was propositioned by an elderly couple. The hostess loosened the drawstrings on her tunic and told me their goose feather mattress had been recently restuffed, while her husband slicked his hair back with spittle. I was determined to endure this ungodly place. I picked my way through the darkness to some scrubland off the market square, and after nibbling on some discarded plums, collapsed, exhausted, under an upturned handcart. I woke to the sound of panting, rhythmic and constant. After lying under the cart until I could bear it no longer, I braced myself and crawled out. But it was not fornication I saw, far from it. It was a middle-aged woman, clad in a loose shirt and short trousers, running laps of the heath at great speed. I stood for a moment contemplating this strange sight. Her curly black hair tied tightly in a bun, her legs pounding like two lively spinning bobs, powering her forward. When she finally paused to catch her breath, I approached carefully. "You must be tired," I offered, instantly wishing for a wittier opener. She looked at me, and I felt her ghostly grey eyes dance over me for the first time.
Says the man who slept under a wheelbarrow.
She smiled in a way that put me at ease instantly. I asked her what she was doing, and she explained she was training. As a messenger, she needed to keep fit, especially now that the quarantine had deprived her of any work. In normal times, she could get to Verona and back 3 times a day, and at half the price of any horseman. I looked at this force of nature with the tensile energy of a child, but a face that was at least 45 years old. She said her name was Acacia. I told her mine was Friar John, and I needed her help. Acacia led me through the quarantined city, pointing out the homes of the friends and relations she'd known and loved long before any sickness. Passing by a low window, I could swear I heard Arnold snoring, but there was no time to investigate. I was intrigued by my new friend. I asked her if she'd ever been lovesick. She smiled at me, and for the first time I noticed the cleft in her upper lip, like a part-drawn curtain through which a nut-brown tooth was peeking.
I've never had the time,
she said. Acacia's home was a small lean-to at the back of a school building. It was dark and fusty, with a distinctive aroma that I soon discovered to be bird droppings. She kept messenger pigeons, birds she was training to carry missives to nearby towns. She believed the experiment would one day make her a rich woman. I had always seen them as nasty pests, but was in no mood to offend my host. Acacia rolled out a mat in a corner, and I sat looking at her feathered friends while she made herbal tea. We began to plan how we might sneak my letter past the guards and on to Mantua. I admitted I didn't trust the pigeons with a delivery of such importance. This stung Acacia.
I hope your message isn't urgent, then,
she sniped, and withdrew behind a ragged curtain. I slouched in embarrassed silence, wishing she'd return, but the longer I waited, the heavier my eyelids grew. I woke to the sound of pigeons cooing. As I lay on my mat, frowning at them, Acacia appeared from behind the curtain. Her presence soothed them instantly, and as she whispered, they bowed their heads in respect. She looked down at me.
You must be tired.
I grinned up blearily. The sun was creeping through a window, framing my host in auburn light. Realizing that time was passing, I pulled the crumpled letter from inside my robes. I told her I wanted to use the pigeons, to take a leap of faith. Acacia beamed. Moving to the furthest hutch, she returned in a flash with Peter, a bird reared in Mantua, who would surely know his way home. After feeding him a small cube of cheese for good luck, she tied my letter to his foot and released him to the skies. We decided not to dwell on Peter's chances and spent the remaining afternoon putting the city back to rights, upending stalls in the marketplace and sluicing stains from the smooth, dark flagstones. At one point, we saw a farmer loping past with a sack full of aubergines. He said that many of the guards had took afternoon siestas and that he'd managed to enter through a tradesman's gate unnoticed. But with no letter to pass on, I was no longer in a rush to leave. A while later, I spotted Arnold climbing the church steps arm in arm with the lady from the night before. He had abandoned his friar's robes and now wore only a lace shirt, which wafted in the wind. His cheeks had the same ruddiness I had noticed before, but his eyes had recovered some of their old sharpness. He introduced the woman as Martha and told me they were to be married. I stood still, unsure what to make of this. Arnold was renouncing his vows, breaking the pledges set out by St. Francis himself, and yet those fierce blue eyes seemed unburdened by this, like they took their orders from somewhere else now. I turned to see Acacia silhouetted against the sunset. gazing proudly at the tidy square. Suddenly I felt heavy and my feet ached unbearably. She took me by the hand and led me, hobbling home. As we ate that night, I voiced my worries to Acacia. Had the sickness corrupted Arnold, a man who had sworn a duty to care for others but now seemed fixated on himself? She appeared to chew over my words with the same slow care that she finished her mouthful. But now she began to tell me about her love of birds, which began when she saw a peacock stalking through the smoke of her father's foundry, its immaculate plumage like something from a vision. She talked about a distant man, more landlord than parent, who had let her keep starlings in a rusty window box. Her gaze was wandering wistfully into the middle distance when something beautiful happened. Voices filtered in from the street, louder than any I'd heard in Valeggio. We craned our necks out of the window just in time to see a procession moving past, men and women, young and old, hand in hand, all singing. And at the front were Arnold and Martha, the newlyweds, a scene you've seen painted on church ceilings and palace walls, two people at the start of their adventure. I was marveling at this loving sight when something wet splashed onto my head and dribbled down my nose. I ducked inside and felt bird excrement, sticky in my hand. Acacia's cackling burst my state of shock, and I began to laugh too, long and hard at the impeccable timing of the universe. When we'd caught our breath, she told me to lie down on the floor while she fetched a basin from the nightstand, and then tenderly, without a word passing between us, she began to wash my head. I shuddered slightly as her fingers traced the nape of my neck, burrowed into the crevices behind my ears, and tugged gently at my thinning hair. I felt her nutty breath on my forehead and looked up into her eyes. What happened next is as old as time, but a step into darkness for everyone. My rattling, sagging, defeated old body gave way to hers, and she undid. In a few moments, the brittle defenses I'd maintained my whole adult life. I felt open and afraid from my flaky scalp down to my hairless shins. In the calmer moments, I thought I felt God above me, observing and noting, preparing his judgment, or perhaps completely indifferent, allowing me my own little adventure. For when it was done, I couldn't help but feel how such a little thing created such theological consternation. Such a fuss about nothing. I fell asleep with a wry smile on my lips. Acacia prodded me awake the next morning, any romance apparently forgotten.
He's back, John. Peter's back.
And sure enough, there was the bird, perched on his cage, my letter still strapped to his leg. I suddenly realized I was naked. While I fumbled for my robes, Acacia had stern words with her employee. She slammed the cage door and turned to me.
I'm sorry,
she said. Don't be. For a moment, I searched for words to express my gratitude for her having fed me, washed me, done her utmost to help me, a poor, confused old fool who she had no prior connection to and was in the early stages of a profound spiritual crisis. She handed me back the letter, and I realized that my mission was not yet over. I still had a duty to Friar Lawrence and to Romeo. I told Acacia this, and she smiled. She didn't protest, but slipped into a nook and returned with an old pair of sandals that belonged to her father. Easing them onto my feet, she told me something I'll never forget.
Duty is love's poorer cousin.
Her front tooth flashed coyly at me. As the sun rose over the city, I stole out of the tradesman's gate, carefully avoiding two soldiers snoozing back to back beneath a tree. Finding the high road blocked by troops, I realized I would not be going to Mantua. I had failed completely in my mission. Strangely, I felt no sense of shame, only a desire to return and tell Friar Lawrence what I had found. By midday, I was once again in fair Verona. My colleague seemed vexed at my delay, and though he was too mealy-mouthed to say so, no doubt blamed me personally for this strange quirk of fate. Still, as I stared at Lawrence's knitted brow, so concerned for the fate of others, I felt sympathy. This man was obsessed with what he ought to be doing, driven by rules and not the stirrings of his heart. When I had described to him all the amazing things I'd seen in Villaggio, Lawrence told me with scarcely concealed relish that as no cure for the sickness could be found, the Duke intended to raze the city to the ground to prevent the infection spreading through the region. I didn't have much time. I knew my priorities were no longer with the friar or with this fine young couple I'd never met, but somewhere else, in a city full of joy with the only person who truly understood me. Turning on my cracked heels, I set off once more for Villaggio. As I hurried down the rocky road, Acacia's father's sandals flapped awkwardly under my feet. I remembered the kind woman who had given them to me, the care with which she'd fastened each strap. Curiously, I no longer felt the appetite for sex that I'd always tried to divert. Something new was moving within me, desire for intimacy, openness, for a companion. My weary mind was whirring at such a speed that I didn't hear the rumble of hooves or a brisk shout as a brigade of soldiers came thundering past. I was brushed like a twig into a roadside ditch and lay stunned, gasping for air. As the dust settled and the clatter died away, I thought I heard the sound of shouting in the distance, the sound of burning. I am a man of faith, and still I can't be sure if I saw a pigeon. It was swooping low towards the ash-white horizon.